to get started?
Sure thing.
All right. For everybody online, thank you so much for joining us for tonight's virtual Science on Tap. It is our first Science on Tap of the academic year. So I hope you're someplace comfortable with some good food and drink as you join us. I know it's hard to find time to attend these types of lectures at night, so thank you again so much for being here with us. My name is Cinnamon Moffett. I'm the Research Program Manager at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center, located in Newport, Oregon, and I will be your host for this evening. Just letting folks know that this is a webinar format, so that means your mics, cameras, and screen shares are disabled, but we do hope that you interact with us using the chat function. You can find that either at the bottom or the top of your screen, depending on your platform. You click the little pop out and you can put in your questions there. You're welcome to put them in at any time. Most likely we'll answer them at the end, but if it's a clarifying question, I might actually jump in and interrupt Will, our speaker this evening, and we'll get some clarification. So feel free to put your questions in at any time. Wanted to also let everyone know we are recording tonight's event, and we'll get it up on the past seminar webpage in a few days, and I'm putting that into the chat right now. And so if you missed something, you want to hear it again, or you'd like to share it with others that are unable to attend tonight, please feel free to share this link. That recording for tonight's seminar will be up there shortly. Wanted to do a little promo for next Science on Tap, which will be December 15th. We have Selena Happel, who is the department head for the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife Conservation Sciences at Oregon State University. Will be giving a talk entitled, "Can We Save Sea Turtles from Climate Change?" Selena is a wonderful speaker, so I'm hoping that you're able to join us at that time on December 15th. If you need information about that talk or any of the other talks that we hold here at Hatfield, you can just search for HMSC. Scroll to the bottom of our homepage. There's a calendar of events there with links to all of our current events and the login information for you to join us. But for this evening, we are very excited to have Dr. Will White here to talk to us about his work around marine reserves. But first, a little bit of background about Will. Will is an associate professor with the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center. Will's research links mathematical models and empirical data to detect patterns of change in noisy data and to make predictions that inform fisheries management and conservation. He got his bachelor's in biology at Davidson College in North Carolina and his PhD in ecology, evolution, and marine biology at the University of California. Dr. White was a professor at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington before joining us at OSU in 2017. We are very excited to have Dr. White here with us sharing his work. So Will, the floor is yours. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Great, thanks, Cinnamon. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I know it's not always a convenient time, but I appreciate you coming in, and I hope you maybe learned something, or at least are somehow entertained. So I wanted to start, thanks for the great sort of biosketch, Cinnamon. I did want to start by sort of explaining where I come from and what I do. I started off my scientific career thinking I was going to be a plant biologist, actually. And I spent time studying grasses and rainforest trees. And when I was studying the rainforest in Australia as an undergraduate, I took a trip down to the Great Barrier Reef and went underwater and realized that was way better. And so then I decided I was going to become a coral reef fish ecologist, and I got my PhD studying tiny little coral reef fish that nobody eats, but are interesting, and they change sex and they do all sorts of interesting things. But it turned out that I was doing my PhD in the mid 2000s in a period when there's a lot of hurricane activity in the Caribbean, where my study site was, and I kept going down and setting up these big experiments, and then having the hurricane come through and knock them all down, and so then I'd go back to the university at the end of the season and not have a lot of data to work with. So I decided I would start playing around with mathematical models as a way of understanding ecological processes in a way that's not so sensitive to hurricanes. And so I developed a number of different projects that, the way we can use models is essentially, if we take everything you know about a system and you write down equations for it, you can make predictions. And then if you see that your predictions match what actually happens in the field, then you're pretty sure you understand the system. And if they don't match, then you go back to the drawing board and you learn more. And so these are a great way of both understanding nature and doing experiments that you can't really do in the field. And so that led me to my next position after my PhD at the University of California, Davis, building mathematical models to help guide the planning process that was happening in California at the time, where California as a state was putting in a network of marine protected areas. And they needed to understand the consequences of different possible spatial configurations of those protected areas. And you can't do that experiment. You can't say, okay, let's put in all these protected areas for 5 years, see what happens, and then stop and then do it again. And then, it's just not practical. So we used models that included the way ocean currents move around fish larvae, that included habitat, that included different scenarios for fisheries management to understand how we could best design protected areas. And so after that process was over, and shortly thereafter, Oregon put in its marine reserves, it became clear that sort of the next scientific question was going to be, how do we manage these reserves? How do we understand how soon things should change inside reserves, and when should they change inside reserves? The name of the game in ecology is that everything is context dependent. That's what we like to say. What's going to happen depends on the specific habitats and the food webs and all these things. And so understanding how to make those predictions so we can figure out if our management is working or not is mostly what my research lab is all about. And so that's what we'll be doing today. So why do we care about marine reserves? Well, locally, this is a very important management question right now. Over the past decade, Oregon put into place 5 different marine reserves and other marine protected areas surrounding them up and down the coast. And we're about to enter a period of evaluating that marine reserve program. So as we speak, maybe not right as we speak, but right now in general, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is preparing a report evaluating what's going on in those protected areas, what's going on in those reserves, and how they've been monitoring them and what they've been learning about the ecology and the human aspects of the way we interact with these marine reserves. That report will be presented in January, and then a university team will be evaluating that report. As it happens, I'm the lead principal investigator of the team that's been selected to review that process. Because that process is still going on, I'm not going to speak a lot about Oregon's marine reserves in particular, just because I don't want to, ODFW is still preparing their report. I haven't seen it, and I don't want to contaminate that process. So what I'm going to think about is marine reserves in general and in sort of the broader global sense. And because the other thing that's happening right now is that there's a big push to protect even more of the ocean in marine reserves and other types of protected areas right now. So you may have heard of this 30 by 30 initiative that groups like the Marine Conservation Institute are leading the charge on. And they say that we need to protect at least 30% of the ocean in fully and highly protected areas to meet a range of environmental and economic goals. And the idea is that this is part of there's a UN climate treaty, the Convention on Biological Diversity, that said we should protect 10% of the ocean by 2020. Nations didn't quite meet that goal, despite having signed the treaty. This is supposed to be an extension of that we're supposed to now protect 30% by 2030. That's the big push. And so the question is that what does that do? Do we need to protect 30% of the global ocean to conserve our ocean environments? How will that affect marine fisheries? What's going on with that? Right now, the current presidential administration has expressed support for that 30 by 30 goal. And so this is going to be a debate we're going to be having as a nation and in the state of Oregon over the next decade. And so today I'm going to talk to you about what we know globally about the way marine reserves work, with the intent that that's going to inform how we interpret what we learn about Oregon's marine reserves over the next year or so. Okay, so first, let's get some definitions out of the way. And boy, there's a lot of words here, because the definition of a marine reserve or marine protected area is very complex. This is my attempt about 10 years ago to condense what the International Union for the Conservation of Nature wrote as the definition of a protected area. Essentially, it's a place in the ocean that we have officially recognized or designated in some way and protected in some means to achieve some kind of conservation goal. And that conservation goal could be trying to achieve some kind of ecosystem service. Maybe we're trying to improve resilience to environmental change. There are cultural aspects of MPAs. We could be protecting particularly culturally significant places. Or in some cases, protected areas are designed to improve the way we do fishery management and improve fishery yields. Okay. These definitions change depending on where in the world you are, what jurisdiction you are. Usually, an MPA, a marine protected area, is a place in the ocean where something is not allowed. Usually that's harvesting, but not always. Sometimes there are places where you can't do mineral extraction or something, but you can do fishing, right? So you have to be very specific when you're talking about what kind of MPA. Marine reserve is usually a special word that means a no-take protected area, a place where you can't fish, you can't harvest any, extract any kind of resources. And that's basically the definition that Oregon uses. The marine reserves are places where you can't go fishing. MPAs are places where some activities are prohibited, but sometimes some types of fishing are allowed. So what I want to talk to you today about is, first, what does putting a part of the ocean in a protected area or a marine reserve do to the life in that area? What benefits does it accrue? And then how does that affect the other activities we might be doing in that area, like fishing, right? How do marine reserves affect fisheries? And are there sort of winners and losers in this process? Are there benefits all around? And what evidence do we have from other marine reserves to help us understand the way these things work? So the first thing that we should talk about is what happens to a population of fish or invertebrates that has been fished and then suddenly fishing stops because it's protected in a reserve. To understand that, we need to think about what does fishing do to a population? And generally speaking, what fishing does is it takes away the older, larger individuals. When you fish things, you're taking them out of the population. They don't get old anymore, they're dead now. And so we see fewer old animals, right? And so what I'm showing in this graphic here is what we call an age distribution. So these gray bars are the relative abundance of animals of different ages in, let's say, a rockfish population. Okay. If there was no fishing, then just because of natural mortality over time, you get fewer and fewer individuals of each successive age, and you might get something that looks like this blue curve here. If this has been fished and fishing starts right at about age 5, then with relatively intense fishing pressure on this population, you'd be missing some of these older, larger individuals. And of course, with things like fish, being old means you're big, and it means you make a lot of eggs, and you might be more important to the population, right? And so we have this gap in what we call the age structure. When you stop fishing, all of a sudden animals start living longer, and they start filling in that age distribution. And so you fill back in all those missing gaps. Okay, it takes time, right? Because how long does it take to get 1 year older? Just 1 year. So if you want to know how long it takes to get more 20-year-old fish, well, it's going to take, many, many years before you see that. So these can be a slow set of processes because of these time lags involved in getting old and getting big, right? Especially for some of the slow growing species that we see on the US West Coast. Now, we could also talk about the role of the level of fishing that was happening before the area was protected in a reserve, and how that affects what happens to the population. And basically, the more you are fishing it beforehand, the bigger scope for change there is, right? If the population had been reduced to a lower level, then it has more space to grow. So what I'm showing in this plot is the relative population density, or the relative abundance of the population, and it's relative to what it was at the time that it became a marine reserve. And so the blue curve is these are sort of arbitrary examples with again, sort of like a blue rockfish, think of that. If there's relatively high fishing, then you could really have a large increase in abundance. If fishing had been much lower, then you'd see a much lower increase. And so we have to know something about how much fishing was happening before a place was protected in a reserve to know what we expect to see in the reserve. And to take this out of the abstract and give you a really specific example, I'm going to take you down to California. In fact, a lot of my examples are going to be from California today, and that's because I've done a lot of work with the protected area network that's in California, in part because it's been around for a little bit longer than the Oregon marine reserves have been around. And so we have more data, And we know a little bit more about how sort of West Coast, especially rocky reef ecosystems work in California than we do in Oregon at this point. So down here, just south of Monterey Bay, there are two sets of MPAs, one in Point Lobos and one in Big Creek. So this is Monterey Bay right here. And these protected areas went into place in 2007. Now, fortunately, some of my collaborators at UC Santa Cruz had been collecting data on kelp forest fish populations before, for about 10 years almost, before those reserves got put into place. And so we had some idea of what these populations looked like before they were protected. Now, one of the problems with managing reserves relative to managing typical fisheries, in typical fisheries, you get to take advantage of the magical fact that fish carry a little data recorder around in their brain. So all fish, bony fishes at least, have a little calcium carbonate structure just behind their brain that it's called an otolith, and it helps them with balance, it helps them with hearing, it sort of helps them know how they're oriented in the water. And the great thing about it is it grows with the fish. So every day of a fish's life, it adds a little bit more of a layer to that calcium carbonate. And over the course of its life, it has little rings, just like a tree. And so when you kill the fish, you can go in there to its skull, yoink out the otolith, and read it just like the rings on a tree and know how old it is. And so if you know how old a bunch of different fish are that you caught, you know how long they tend to live. And so you can know how fast we're killing them with fishing. You can't do that in a reserve because you don't want to go into a reserve, which is designed to protect fish, and go kill a bunch of fish. You can look inside their skulls. That kind of defeats the point. So instead, we have to look at the sizes of the fish, not their brains. And so we developed a numerical method that we can take the sizes of fish and figure out, based on what we know about the relationship between age and size of fish, how heavily we've been fishing a population, basically by how few big fish there are in the population. So if we have years and years and years of scuba surveys, counting fish and measuring them, we can get some idea of things. And so, for example, at the Point Lobos population, we had data from inside what became the reserve before it was a reserve, and data from reference sites outside. And so we could tell that there was actually pretty intense fishing pressure there, which makes sense because it's really close to Monterey. So there's lots of fishermen there. And what we were able to do is then predict what would happen after protection. And these red and blue lines are those predictions. If the reserve was totally protected and there's no fishing in it, we'd expect that red curve. So it would dip down a little bit at first, which is really counterintuitive. It turns out in this case, it's because there hadn't been a lot of reproduction in that area before it was protected. And so we expected it to actually, the population was declining a little bit. And then once reproduction kind of caught up again, it would pick up. If it was sort of a business as usual and it hadn't been protected, we would have expected the blue curve, okay, which also dipped down, but then increased back up to not as much. And then these points, I realize it's very busy here. These points are data that didn't contribute to the lines. These lines aren't trying to fit through the data. I just laid them on top, and you can see that the lines do go through the data. So we're actually getting not a bad fit considering how noisy these data are. And the data support that same idea that it was declining a little bit and then starting to pick back up. Now, of course, the other problem with this is that these sort of shaded areas are our uncertainty around our model predictions. And you can see they overlap for about 20 years after protection. So it's not until we get this little white window right in there between those two that we can be really sure we're seeing different things inside the reserve than outside. So the part of the message here is that patience is really important. But also the message is that in this scenario where there's a lot of fishing, we expect to see an increase in fish abundance inside the reserve relative to reference sites. Further down the coast, off the Big Sur coast here, in a much more remote MPA, there was very little, almost no fishing in this population beforehand. And so the projections for with and without fishing are completely identical. And the data support that as well, that there's really no difference there. And so this is our basic expectation that what we expect to see in these places depends on what we were doing there beforehand. And we don't expect to see big changes if there's sort of no change in status, essentially. Okay. So if we go beyond these single examples and ask globally, are there more fish in reserves? Is there more fish biomass in marine reserves than not in marine reserves? And the answer is usually, sometimes, but not always. So these results are from a global, what we call a meta-analysis. Basically, my colleague Sarah Lester and her co-authors compiled data from all over the globe, studies inside and outside of marine reserves, before reserves went into place and after reserves, and asked, what's the change? What's the relative difference inside and outside, or before and after, in the biomass of fish and invertebrates, in their density, just their numbers, in their size, and in species richness, how many species are there? And they found that overall, there was a huge difference in biomass and abundance. Something, I didn't put the average on here, but it's something like 300 or 400% more biomass of fish inside reserves than outside. But not always. The ones that colored red down here actually had less inside than outside, or less abundance inside than outside. And there are a lot of different reasons that could be. It could be that those are like prey species, and so as you get more big fish eating them, they decrease. It could be that we've just not waited long enough. Like if you look back at the slide I just showed you, if you had measured this stuff 5 years after the reserve went into place, you would have found a negative change, not a positive change. That's not what you want. So there are a lot of different reasons. And following up on this study, a team led by some investigators in Tasmania did a different global synthesis, and they identified the 5 things that make reserves have more fish in them than outside of them. And they called this, marine biologists like acronyms, right? So they called this Neoli, and Neoli stands for no take. So if you allow some fishing, then you're going to have fewer fish than if you don't fish at all. Enforced, right? So if you have what we call a paper park, where there's no enforcement whatsoever, then it might as well not be a protected area. Old, because it takes time. Biology takes time to accumulate large, old individuals. Large, and large because if you have a protected area, it has to encompass the movements of the species in them, right? If fish have a 10-kilometer diameter home range and they're in a 5-kilometer diameter protected area, they're going to be constantly moving out of the protected area where they're vulnerable to fishing. So large is really important. And then isolated. And isolated doesn't mean it has to be on some remote atoll someplace. Isolated means that they work better when they completely enclose a habitat patch, like a rocky reef that's completely inside a protected area, versus a reserve where half of the reef is in the reserve and half is not, because the fish there's no road signs, right? The fish just move. And so they'd be going back and forth and making themselves vulnerable. So those are the things that make reserves happen. Now, I want you to keep in mind that these primary effects of putting a population inside a reserve are what everything else flows from. You get bigger fish, older fish, and more fish. And so if we want to think about what are the follow-on effects of marine reserves on the ecosystem as a whole, everything has to flow from those basic mechanisms, right? And so as we have more and more reserves across the globe, we begin to think like, what other kinds of things could they do? If we want to do more than just have more fish, are reserves part of that solution? And in particular, what's really become part of the conversation in the past few years is this idea of ecosystems that are more resilient to climate change, right? And so, for example, I was part of a working group that put this report together earlier this year, where we got a bunch of experts on all different aspects of marine ecology and marine resources together and asked, okay, can marine reserves be part of a climate solution? This is not just for California, but sort of globally. What can they do to help us conserve our ecosystems? And in thinking about these solutions, we have to think about, what protected areas actually do. What are reserves actually doing? And if there's mostly just stopping fishing, then the degree to which we get benefits from them depend on whether this was a place that was fished a lot before. Otherwise, there's not really a big difference. And are the species that we're interested in that can provide what we call ecosystem services, are they likely to benefit from that protection? Okay. Well, the first thing that we can think about is that big fish and big invertebrates make more babies, right? Typically in these marine individuals, bigger animals have more biomass and more space for big ovaries, and they make more eggs, right? And then when they spawn, those eggs can travel not just inside the MPA, but outside to fished areas and supplement fisheries. And we're learning now because of some recent work by folks like Dustin Marshall down in Australia, that for a long time we thought that reproductive output was proportional to the size of the fish. But now we're learning that it's actually more than proportional, that a fish that weighs 10 kilograms produces way, way more than twice as many eggs than a fish that weighs two fish that weigh 5 kilograms. So there's this disproportionate benefit of having specifically large fish, not just biomass, but biomass in large fish. And so this is a figure from their paper where they said that global meta-analysis I showed you earlier said that on average fish are 28% larger inside of marine reserves. That translates into 100%, and this is in terms of length, right? That turns into a more than 100% difference in their mass. And then that can lead to somewhere between a 100 and 200% increase in their reproductive output. Now, don't worry about the Jensen's inequality thing. That's just a detail dealing with how variable sizes are inside and outside of reserves. So this means that putting part of the fish population inside reserves can have this huge benefit to the population, because those big fish that accumulate in there could be producing larvae that then go out into the fishery and provide more fish that we can catch and eat, which would be great. Right? This would also provide some resilience to climate change in theory, because if you have bigger populations, then the loss of fish or invertebrates to disturbances would be mitigated somewhat. Now, there's some other really interesting complex interactions dealing with the food web that could also provide some benefits in some reserves. Okay, so here's an example from Southern California, where the kelp forests in Southern California are dealing with this invasive algal called Sargassum honorii. They call it the devil weed. Basically, it's this really, really weedy understory kelp species that's come into some of those kelp forest habitats and crowded out some of the native species, the native understory kelp species. Well, it turns out that's happening in places that are open to fishing, but not in some of the really old reserves in the California Channel Islands. And that's because those reserves have bigger fish and bigger lobsters that eat sea urchins. If you have fewer sea urchins, you have more of the native kelps, and they're better able to resist those invasive algae. And so the populations of the kelp forest community as a whole inside those older reserves are more resistant to this invasive species, which is a really great outcome. Sort of the downside of that story is that the younger reserves hadn't built up those big fish yet, or those big lobsters yet, and so they didn't see that same benefit. So it takes a long time to accrue this type of benefit. Okay, a related story is that several years ago, when you probably have heard that the sunflower stars had a epizootic disease across the entire West Coast and died off, and in many cases that's led to an increase in the urchin population. At these locations in Southern California, when that happened, inside the reserves, when the Pycnopodia went away, you had other species that could feed on the urchins. So this guy, the California sheephead, which is a great, both commercially and recreationally fished species, and lobsters were still there in the reserve and could feed on those urchin they could feed on those urchin herbivores and keep the urchin numbers lower and preserve the kelp forests in ways that unprotected sites didn't to the same degree. So this is not an interaction that happens in every single food web, keep in mind, right? We don't have California sheephead in Oregon. And so this is not a type of food web interaction that can happen in every single MPA. And I think that's the sort of context dependency we need to keep in mind, that some of these benefits that we like to see in reserves can't happen in every single reserve across the globe because we don't have the same food web in every location across the globe, right? Now, a different example, and one that a lot of people are really eager to think about, is whether the bigger animals that are inside reserves might be more resistant to climate stressors. And the classic example of this, and really kind of unfortunately the only example that we're aware of this happened down in the Sea of Cortez. And so a team from Stanford University has been studying pink abalone in the Sea of Cortez for many years. And what they observed is that there was a big hypoxic mortality event that happened in 2009. So there was low dissolved oxygen, similar to what happens off the coast of Oregon here. And it killed off lots and lots of animals, including a lot of these abalone. And so what I'm showing you here is the number of abalone individuals at their study sites, both in fished areas and in a reserve. And you can see that abundances of abalone dropped in both places after that hypoxic mortality, but they dropped more in the fished area than in the reserve. And it looks like what happened is that the really big abalone were more resistant to hypoxia, and they survived. And then they started making babies that then reseeded the fished area, right? That's a great success story. It's a little confusing because with physiological theory, we tend to think of bigger animals as having greater net metabolic demands for oxygen. And so it almost seems like in most cases, big animals should be more susceptible than small animals. And so this is a topic of investigation. We're trying to look for other examples of how this could happen in species like, say, Dungeness crabs, right? But all those investigations are still ongoing. The last thing that reserves can do is just protect the habitat, particularly if some human activity would destroy a sensitive habitat like deep water corals or deep water sponges. And so a number of protected areas are designed to just protect sensitive benthic species, these long-lived, slow-growing species that provide habitat for lots of other fish and invertebrates, just protect them from destruction from like trawling gear or from anchors and pots and things like that. And so that's another form of protection that reserves can provide. There are things that reserves can't do, right? They can't keep the water cooler, right? There's some hints that maybe we could have some effects of some species in reserves, like kelps and seagrasses, could provide some benefits to water chemistry and mitigate things like ocean acidification or hypoxia. I think the jury is still out on the degree to which those effects are really that strong and the degree to which protection reserves can really provide those effects, but there's a lot of people working on them. The other type of protection that we see that's really habitat-based is protecting juvenile habitats. So I come from North Carolina, where the shrimp industry is really big. And right now they're going through a big debate about limiting shrimp trawling in inshore habitats that are juvenile nurseries for a lot of important fishery species. So if you keep the shrimp trawlers out of like seagrass beds, then you get more fish later on. So those protected areas are an important part of that solution. All right. So I've talked about all the sort of hoped for benefits and how sometimes in some places, in some food webs, in some environmental contexts, you can realize these really important conservation benefits of marine reserves. Of course, the big question is, what happens to the fisheries? We stopped fishing in that location. What does that do to the fishing industry? What does that do to fishery landings? What happens? This is a really hard problem to solve, and basically for two reasons. The first one is that you catch a fish, you don't know where it came from. Where was it born? Was it born inside a reserve and now you were able to catch it because it moved out of the reserve or traveled on ocean currents as a larva outside of the reserve? It's really hard to figure that out. And the second one is that when we put in reserves, that's usually not the only thing we're changing in the system. There are other management changes that might be happening at the same time. There's market forces. We could have people entering the fishery or leaving the fishery, changes in the demand for different types of fish. So it's really hard to suss out the effects of just the reserve on fisheries. So I'm going to give you a few examples of attempts to try to sort these questions out. The first one comes from my colleague, Robin Pelk. She did her PhD in the same lab that I did years ago. And for her PhD, she was really interested in this question of whether populations inside marine reserves make larvae that then travel outside and supplement fisheries outside the reserves. This is called spillover, right? And so she went down to South Africa and found 3 different reserves. And she was studying the mussel fishery in these reserves. This is an intertidal fishery. People go out and collect mussels. And mussels are great because they broadcast spawn. So they toss their gametes up into the water column at low tide. Sorry, at high tide. At low tide would be a bad time to do that. At high tide, they release their gametes into the water column, and the eggs and sperm unite and turn into little larvae that then get carried away on ocean currents. What's awesome about mussels is that you can catch them as they're settling back to the benthos, as they're settling back to the intertidal. So you get these little rubber kitchen scrubby sponges and bolt them down to the rocky intertidal, and the little mussel larvae are, to be honest, not very smart, and they think that those little scrubby sponges are the byssal threads, little threads that attach adult sponges to the rock. That's a great place for a little baby mussel to be. And so they go into the little toughy scrubbers, and then you can just go around and pick them up, rinse them out, and count how many larvae you get. So you get an idea of the relative number of larvae settling in different places. So that's what Robin did. She spent a long time rinsing little mussel larvae out of sponges. And this is what she found. This is the key result, that at these two reserves, Galcama and Duesa, she found that there was this really steep gradient in the abundance of mussel larvae going from inside the reserves to outside. And she interpreted that as there being a lot of larvae produced inside the reserves, and some of them spilling over out of the edge out to these fished areas where there are fewer larvae being produced. And so as you get further away from the reserve, you don't get very many larvae at all. But then there was this third reserve where she didn't find the same pattern at all. She found there was no difference whatsoever in the number of mussel larvae she was catching. And her interpretation of that is that that one is a place where it turns out there's not much mussel harvesting. And so you wouldn't expect to see a big difference in the number of mussel larvae settling, because you get a lot of larvae being produced outside relative to inside as well. Whereas in these two places, there was quite a bit of harvest. And so there's very few mussels that were reaching reproductive size and producing larvae outside the reserve. So there's spillover. There's spillover here too, right? It's just that there's still a lot of reproduction outside the reserve. And so you can't detect it. You can't tell that there's more production happening inside the reserve that's supplementing the fishery. So this is the problem of detection. Another way people have tried to get at this problem is with genetics, right? You can do paternity analysis on fish just like you can do on people. The problem is that when you do paternity analysis on a human, typically if you have a child and probably have a pretty good idea of the candidate number of potential fathers of that child, right? And you just sample them and you're pretty sure you're going to get one of them is going to be a hit. Fish populations are huge, and fish don't like to talk about who they mated with and how many offspring they've made. It's very difficult to get that information from fish. So you can do what this crew down at UC Santa Cruz did. This is again around the Monterey Peninsula. They sampled 6,000 fish. So they caught the fish, took a little clip of their fin, genotyped them, and then tried to match up parent fish to offspring fish. And they found a few matches, but they only found 8 out of 6,000 fish. And what they found was that sure enough, you can find examples of parent fish inside reserves making babies that go to outside reserves. You can find examples of them making babies that go into the same reserve, they just stayed at home, or they go to a different reserve. All different types of pathways are possible, but with only 8 different unique, pathways observed, it's really hard to quantify how much that's happening. And so this becomes a really ongoing question of how do we quantify how much of a support there could be from these reserves to these fished areas. It's really hard to study. So the other thing we could do is look at fishery landings, right? And try to understand whether we're catching more fish after a reserve is put into place. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories that all have 3 different outcomes, right? The first one is on the Great Barrier Reef, where back in 2004, they increased the total area that was protected from fishing on the Great Barrier Reef. And it turns out that the landings of this handsome fellow, the coral trout is not a trout, it's a grouper. Australians call groupers gropers, but they also like to call this grouper a trout because they crack me up. Anyway, this is the coral trout. It's the main fishery on the Great Barrier Reef. And landings were reduced. But it turns out just putting in the reserves wasn't the only explanation for why landings were reduced. The Australian government knew that there would be problems for the fishery when they increased these protected areas. And so they invested a whole lot of money in buying out some of the fishery sector and having them reorient to different industries. So there was also reduced effort. There were fewer fishers, and so of course you'd expect to have lower landings. So that's not necessarily saying that the reserves led to reduced landings. There was a change in the fishery as well. Going to the US, the past decade or so saw the creation of the Northwest Hawaiian Islands National Marine Sanctuary and the Papahanaumokuakea National Marine Sanctuary. This is all around the Hawaiian archipelago. And a recent study just showed that despite fears that there would be a great reduction in the catch of the really valuable big-eye tuna fishery, there was actually no negative effect on longline tuna, primarily because most of the fishing that was happening even before those protected areas were put in place, was not happening inside those zones. There were more productive fishing grounds elsewhere, and so there wasn't a net negative effect on the fishery. And then the other story is back to one of those South African marine reserves, the Gokama Reserve, where some scientists found that there was actually increased catch per unit effort for the sea bream species near the reserve. So fish were getting big inside the reserve, moving out and getting caught, and it was actually helping the fishery. So it all depends on what's going on with the fishery, where people were fishing beforehand, and what other management actions were taken as to what the effects are going to be. And so I want to just briefly hit on this idea that the intersection of marine reserve management and fishery management is really what the story is here. I'm just drawing a cartoon, but this is the basic scenario with fishery management, the basic problem with fishery management. If you put fishing effort on the horizontal axis here and landings on the vertical axis, you're ultimately always going to see a hump shape, right? If you don't fish at all, you're not going to catch any fish. There's some level of fishing that lets you catch a lot of fish and catch sustainably. And if you fish too much, then you catch all the fish and then you don't have any fish left to catch. How does that translate into the way marine reserves work? Well, some folks have proposed that relationship looks pretty similar, that without any reserves, you're catching some amount of fish. If you add in reserves, you get all those great spillover effects and you boost fishing, like we saw in that South African example. But then if you close off too much of the ocean, then there's no place left to fish, and you decrease landings. Others have argued, correctly, I think, that the relationship could look more like this, that adding in area and reserves is always bad for the fisheries because the fishery is managed just well, it was just great. You had really nice sustainable fishing, and now you're just closing off fishing grounds and squeezing the remaining fishing effort into fewer places and just decreasing your landings. And the basic idea is that these interactions really matter, that if you have poor fishery management and it's being managed unsustainably, then setting aside some places where fish can get really big and have a lot of reproduction can really be helpful to the fishery. You get that spillover benefit. But if you have really conservative fishery management, like you might argue we do in Oregon, we have a lot of really data-rich fisheries who spend a lot on our fishery management efforts, then it's possible that we just see a decrease in fishery landings as you add in area and reserves because you've closed off fishing grounds for a sustainable fishery. Okay. The other aspect of the interaction between protected areas of any kind and management is that we need to make sure that these two processes are talking to each other, right? For example, we manage a lot of our fisheries with fishery stock assessments, where we're keeping track of how much fish biomass is out there. And a difficulty that we sometimes see is finding a way to make sure that we're counting the fish that are in the reserves as part of the greater population in that assessment. And so, for example, if we don't have a good way of counting how many fish are in the reserves and having them enter into that tally, then we might have sort of locked away fish in protected areas, and we're not giving the fishery credit for that effect. And so this is a problem as we evolve the way we do stock assessments to account for these spatial protected areas, that we need to make sure that these two processes are communicating with each other. Another aspect of this that has been proposed but not really done very much yet is that part of fishery management is trying to figure out what the fish population looks like now relative to what it looked like before we started fishing it, relative to an unfished population. And the hope is that maybe we could use reserves as a reference point because they look like an unfished population. And the issue is that they might not look that way yet, because as I've tried to convey, it could take a long time to build up that age structure and build up that biomass in the reserves. So I think I'm right at 6:40. Wow, I'm amazingly right on time here, I think. To sort of wrap up the messages that I've tried to share with you today, if we think about fisheries and marine reserves, if we're doing a really good job of managing the fishery, then we're unlikely to see an additional benefit of reserves to the fishery. It's really just in these over-harvested or overexploited systems where reserves are expected to have these magical spillover benefits. But there are probably ways, and I think this is going to be the next generation of fishery science, of matching up those reserve efforts and the conventional management that we do to sort of synergize and minimize negative effects in both cases. There's ways that these two processes can talk to each other, keeping in mind that there's a lot of potential non-fishery benefits of reserves. More reproduction seems to be a pretty clear message. In some cases, in some habitats, in some ecosystems, we could see reserves being part of a climate resilience package, and having more large animals that fill out the food web could be a really important part of resilience to climate impacts. Keeping in mind that there's time lags in seeing a lot of those benefits. It takes time to build up that biomass and those large animals, and that we don't always see or don't always expect to see all those benefits in every single reserve, because it depends on were you fishing it beforehand. It depends on what the food web looks like as to whether you can see some of the stories that I've told you today. With that, I would like to acknowledge the variety of agencies that have contributed to the science, at least the science that I did, that I talked about today. If you'd like to read more about some of the work I talked about, you can find the two different websites here, my research lab's website, and then the Coastal Oregon Marine Experiment Station website. And then if you're on Twitter, you can follow my personal account or the lab account that my students mostly run, the Coombs account, and then I'm engaged with the Partnership for Interdisciplinary Study for Coastal Oceans, which is a multi-campus West Coast research consortium that studies rocky reef and intertidal habitats primarily, fisheries, marine protected areas, and their response to climate change. And you can follow us on Twitter there as well.
Thank you so much, Will. We are getting questions coming in already. So for folks that are online, please feel free to go ahead and put your questions in chat. Remember, we are on a webinar, so the only way that you can communicate with us is via chat. Will, the first two questions that came in were kind of clarifying questions to some of the stories you told. So the first one I see here is, has the invasive sargassum been detected in Oregon kelp forests?
Not to my knowledge. I think it's more of a southerly, warmer water species, is my impression.
Okay, and then Gail asked, could the food chain dynamics affect the abalone populations inside and outside reserves, or are there no abalone predators there in that particular story that you gave?
Yeah, so, and I don't know a lot about the abalone part of the food web in the Sea of Cortez. I know here on the West Coast that, the main thing driving abalone dynamics here is whether you have kelp or not, and the availability of not so much abalone predators, but the food of the abalone. But I can't speak specifically to what's happening with that pink abalone story in the Sea of Cortez.
Okay, we also have somebody just jumping in and saying another point to make is the potential density limits of production and populations of in the MPAs.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a good point, John. And yes, at some point, theoretically, you sort of reach the carrying capacity of that area. I think here with West Coast populations that I study, there is so much interannual variability, primarily due to fluctuations in larval supply, that you don't really see these fisheries like hitting a cap and going forward. There's a lot of interannual variability, but what you do see, even though those numbers fluctuate, is you do see in reserves more older, larger fish.
We had a question or kind of a comment that maybe you can speak to about, it seems like the benefit for the Oregon Marine Reserves is going to be a tough sell when we have such a short expectation of benefits, kind of this 10-year plan. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's, I like to say that part of my research program is setting expectations for how soon we can see changes. And that's absolutely right, that, when you have slow growing species like rockfish in particular, it takes a while to see change, and we should be cognizant of that.
So this question is a little bit more of a clarification. You mentioned more reproduction as a benefit to the reserves. Isn't that also a benefit to the fisheries? I
would say yes. Yeah, that one cuts both ways. It's a benefit to the reserve population and to the segment of the population that's fish.
Yeah. So someone from Surfrider said you didn't talk much about the people science. So curious about, given goals that lead to the design and placement of marine reserves that are human driven. Can you speak a little bit more about people and in the ecological interactions?
That's a great point. And, Ray Hilborn likes to say that managing fish is managing people. And so that's why part of the assessment team that I'm part of for the Oregon system includes my co-PI, Kelly Biedenweg, who's a social scientist, who will be really leading that human aspect of things, where I would confess I do not have expertise.
And this next question might jump on that a little bit, but outside of landings, can you talk about some of the other social impacts, both positive and negative, of marine reserves and the ones that you've studied?
Yeah, I mean, the one people like to talk about is tourism. You know, you want to go see these big animals. I know that I've been diving in some of the protected areas down in the Florida Keys, where partially as a result of protection, you can see some of the big grouper species that we didn't used to see. And you know, that's just being able to see things get big is definitely a benefit. Yeah, that's a big question. What are some other social impacts? I mean, certainly there are negative impacts on some segments of the fishery. There are people who lose the places where they used to like to fish. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. You know, ironically, I was really involved in the California MPA planning process, and there's sort of an irony there that a lot of the marine ecologists that I know who work at, say, marine labs on the California coast were advocates for having parts of the ocean next to their marine labs be placed in these protected areas. And once that happened, they found that they no longer were able to go get collecting permits to get animals to bring back to their classes or to do some of the experiments they wanted to do. And so that was a sort of ironic, a negative impact. But certainly, you know, there are impacts on the marine economy. If you can't fish in certain places and can't go in certain places, that's going to have an effect.
I'm going to jump a question here because this next one is a little bit related. Are there specific selection criteria for marine reserves in California or Oregon, such as, kind of speaking to what you were talking about around targeting areas that are overfished or specific habitats or minimum size?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I know more about the California process because I was not in Oregon when the Oregon reserves were put into place. I know that there was, in California, there were scientific criteria that were established that didn't really specifically mention fishery. It was more based on habitat and sort of the spatial configuration. How big are they? How far away are they from each other? My understanding is that in Oregon, it was driven primarily by sort of local stakeholder groups coming together to put together proposals like, here's this special place that we want to protect. And then that went through a decision process to select the eventual 5 that were chosen. But I confess to not having been here to observe that process.
Okay, so let's jump back.
Surfrider's pointing out that it was driven by the OPAC. That's right.
Yeah. Let's jump back to that question that we missed. And this is another clarifying question. Some of your earlier charts showed the trend of the fish population compared to reserves, low fishing at first to heavy fishing. The only data points seem to be in the earlier years, but as projection goes on, projection goes out, suggesting convergence to maximum. What is the basis of that projection? Yeah,
that's right. So that was a size-based population model that did have, sort of going back to John DeVore's question earlier, we did put a sort of a maximum density of juvenile fish that you could have in that area. And so it was based on that type of projection. And so we fit the model to data prior to 2007 and then ran it out for about 20 or 25 years afterwards. And then those points you saw were overlaid on. And so those are the points, the data that reflected up to the point that we wrote the paper back in like 2016. Yeah.
Great, thanks for that clarifier, Will. So another question we've got here is, have you noticed a change in angler attitude towards marine reserves, especially across the states that you've studied?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a variety of different attitudes. I know I've spoken to a lot of different fishermen in different regions, and the attitudes range from, these are a terrible idea, we don't need these, you know, we're doing a great job fishing and this is just closing off fishing grounds. You know, I think that's, I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth. That's probably the view for a lot of Dungeness crab fishers, right, in the state, where some of the reserves closed off a lot of good fishing grounds, and you know that the Dungeness crab fishery seems to be doing well, and it's not clear how that could be managed effectively in a spatial way. Other fishermen I speak to say, you know what, I realize that this is going to be a hardship for me, but it's an investment in the future, and you know, would help make sure that future generations have some of these big animals and healthy populations. So I think there's a real diversity of opinions. And I look forward to seeing some of the social science research that comes out of the ODFW report, because I think they've been doing some survey work to try to gauge some of these effects.
This question talks a little bit about reserves helping long-lived species clearly, but are there short-lived fish species that get clobbered because of the reserves, or things like urchins?
Yeah, I wouldn't say, so there is some evidence from some reserves that as you tend to get more really big things like lingcod, that there are some predator-prey effects, and that some of the smaller rockfishes don't increase as much as you might think because you got a big honking lingcod and they're eating them. I think that's been shown up in some areas of Washington, but I have to check my sources on that. Yeah, urchins, any of these that have these really strong predator-prey effects become complicated, because on the one hand, you're protecting urchins from fishing. On the other hand, you are increasing the predators. And so it really depends on how much harvesting there was beforehand and how much harvesting there was of the predators. And it's difficult to make a blanket statement about that, I would say.
So this question, I'm not gonna, you did a good job doing the acronym and pronouncing it, but I'm not gonna be able to do it. But in light of Neoli in Oregon, are the marine reserves large enough, extensive enough to have a positive impact? And I know you said you weren't gonna talk too much about Oregon, but maybe you can speak a little to
Yeah, well, I would
your
say that, yeah. All of those, that's a very catchy name, right? Neoli. That it's like, oh, they gotta be old. Right. Well, how old? How old depends on the species that we're talking about, and we've got a diversity of species here. They've got to be large. What does that mean? You know, it depends on the species we're talking about, and so I think that there are absolutely fish species that, and invertebrate species in Oregon that we care about a lot, that move too much to be effectively protected by some of these protected areas. But there are other species that don't. They're, you know, stay at home and are going to hang out in those places and not leave them. And so I think it comes back to, what do you want the reserve to do, and what kind of expectation should we have for which species will benefit and which species won't? And it's a real challenge to make these really broad statements, right?
Yeah, I think this next question kind of goes to that as well. You know, what is your goal? And it's asking, should there be different reserves for adult habitats versus juvenile habitats?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are instances of reserves that have been planned to, let's say, so this is a big problem, not a big problem. This is a big topic in a lot of Caribbean fisheries, where things like mangrove, not Caribbean, I should say coral reefs in general, where mangrove habitats are important nursery areas for things like snappers that hang out there as juveniles and then move out to the coral reef. And it's been shown that if you have a connection there, sort of a corridor, where you can track, we call these ontogenetic movements. They change with development, what habitat they're using. And so if you can protect that whole track, then you have a better outcome. So yeah, there's evidence for that for sure.
I think you're in line with this next statement, which is the network of marine reserves seems to be important for connectivity. So maybe adding networked to Neoli would be great.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You're getting thank yous and perfect, and thanks for your time. Let's see.
I see there's a question about highly migratory species.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and so that's a great question. So I would say there's some examples where protecting sort of special habitats in the life of a species can be important. So, for example, there are a lot of tropical species that migrate to spawn. They aggregate to a seamount or something like that, sort of a special part of the coral reef. And just protecting that area is really important, because that's a place where they're very vulnerable to overharvesting. You can harvest, all the Nassau grouper in a huge region all in one spot. And so protecting those areas can be really important. There's been a move lately to try to have sort of large pelagic protected areas that might protect some of these migratory species, or dynamic protected areas where you have the protected area move with the migration. Those are all still pretty hypothetical, I think, and people are trying to figure out how you would make that work.
Just wanted to put a little plug in there. If you have your hand raised, go ahead and type in your question. I'm afraid I'm unable to mute you in this format. Or you can reach out to Will directly with your question if that's easier for you in this particular, depending on what device you were on. So I think we are perfectly on time. I can't believe that happened. That is rare for Will and I both to be perfectly on time. Again, you're getting lots of thank yous and
Thank you all for listening. I really appreciate it.
yeah, it's just been a really nice summary of the things that we've been thinking about. And I think we're all primed and ready to learn a little bit more from the ODF&W report that should be coming out soon.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Maybe we can
All
do
right.
this again in a year once we're more into the Oregon process.
Oh, that sounds like a good plan. Everybody agree? Yeah. Yeah. All right. For everybody online, thank you so much for joining us. Again, I appreciate your time and willingness to be with us and to listen to Will's information. I hope to see you next month on the 15th when Selena Happel presents her work as well. And until then, thank you so much again, Will, for your time. We appreciate you sharing with us.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
All right, bye, everyone.